Great. So welcome, Matthias, to this wonderful church. We're meeting here just before your concert at the Vilnius University St. John's Church, and after your presentation at the conference that was organized by the Vilnius University Library called Reformatio Baltica, right? So can you talk a little bit what was the theme of your presentation?
The theme of my presentation was the question, how did organ music sound after Reformation? What did the organists play during the services in liturgy? And what can we know from the sources? So I asked three kinds of sources, starting with the church orders and the agendas, but they don't say very much after Reformation. Later they say more, but in the first decades they say what organists not are allowed to play, but only seldom what they should play. And then, second, I looked at the documents about auditions when organists applied for a post of a church, what they were asked to play, a motet, sometimes a transposed motet. They should improvise a German psalm, and they should be able to play in the organopleno and other things. The third thing I presented here, and I think it's only a starting point for a bigger project where we have to ask a lot of more sources, was two big sources of organ music that we know very good. The Celle tablature from 1601, that is not now preserved, but we have photocopies in Berlin and know the contents of this source, and the Visby tablature. The Visby tablature I investigated last year. I went to Gotland to look at this source, and it's very interesting to find a whole cycle of Magnificat by Hieronymus Praetorius, and some more Magnificat by other composers, also his son Jacob Praetorius, and a lot of liturgical organ music with this by an anonymous. There was one musicologist about 30 years ago who had the thesis that also these pieces are by Hieronymus Praetorius. And I'm not sure if this is right. I think this could be like a book that an artist makes with drawings. He sees a picture and he makes a sketch what he has seen. And so I think this Berend Petri, who started writing the source, had the compositions by Praetorius, by Hieronymus and by Jacob, and then he made his own tries. In what matter one plays during the liturgy. But not to play these pieces one-to-one within the service, but to learn how to manage, how to improvise, how to get the right counterpoint to the cantus firmus. This is not, in my opinion, it's not music to be played as we do today, but music as a starting point for his own improvisations.
That is so fascinating idea you just briefly mentioned, Matthias, because I remember musicologist Ibo Ordgis talking about the idea that majority of these pieces written up to 1750 or even later were meant to be as models for composition and improvisation. Not necessarily, as you say, for performing in concerts, but just as models for people and students and later generations to learn, isn't it?
Yes, he's right, and there are some others who agree with this thesis. We can see, for instance, that the Magnificat have not the right number of verses for the alternatim praxis. So, what does the number of 3 or 4 verses mean? There are 3 or 4 different models in counterpuntal technique, and the organist is the one who chooses from these techniques what he wants to play.
Wonderful. And when you looked at, for example, at Visby tablature, did you have to read this new German tablature notation?
Yes, I did so.
Wonderful.
There's one curious thing that is not very common. We have this only writer, Berend Petri, and he wrote this in his lessons in Hamburg. And some decades later, we find the same source in Visby, where it is until today. But some years ago, no one knew how it is come to Visby. And now a young researcher, Beate Bugenhagen, has found out that this Berend Petri later was organist at St. Nikolai Church in Stralsund. And one of his pupils, David Herlitz, went from Stralsund to Visby and became the organist of the cathedral. Mm-hmm. And I suppose there's one piece that is not Berend Petri, but also not Jacob Praetorius, not Hieronymus Praetorius, one later written down piece on two empty pages. And I suppose that this piece is written by David Herlitz around 1620 perhaps. And I will play it tonight in the concert. It's also verses on the Magnificat, a little bit more modern than the Hieronymus Praetorius Magnificat versets are, and a kind of chorale fantasia with 3 different measures of the Cantus Firmus.
Wonderful. So let's remind our listeners who are wondering about what is the new German tablature notation. How can you read it? What are the features of it?
First of all, it needs very few space.
Yeah.
You write not as we do with the partial notation in a type of coordinate system.
Stave notation, right, with 5 lines?
Yeah, but I think so as a system. So you write but you write with every tone what it is. So you can write it like a novel. Uh-huh. You write only A, B, C, and you don't need more space for it. If you have written a little bit, it's not very difficult to read. Perhaps a little bit difficult to play after this. I don't do so. I transcribe it, but you can read it very good. There are some mistakes in the transcriptions if it's not very clear what octave it is. Uh-huh. That's not easy to read. There are lines and you have to look very careful on it, and sometimes there's missing a little bit of the paper, and so it's difficult.
Uh-huh. So for example, the note C would be notated as the letter C, right? And the octave would be notated as the one line, first octave, 2
and the
lines.
line is longer for more stems, for more letters, and if the line goes under the octave, the line is broken, and then it starts new afterwards. And it's not every time clear how long it is.
Not always so consistent, right? And what about the rhythms then? How can rhythms be notated in such a case?
Over this line, there's another line with rhythm indications, and they are very similar to our signs of the
quarter notes and 16 notes, right?
16 notes and 8 notes. These lines where they are kept together.
So fascinating. In 17th century, even in 16th century, people in Germany or German-speaking lands probably felt more at home with the new organ tablature notation than with the
Yes,
stave
of course.
notation, right?
Yes, of course. And for a very long time, also from the later 18th century, we have examples where organists, when they shortly and very fast wanted to notice something, to sketch something, they have written in tablature, because it was very fast and it didn't need much space. Also very famous, the Orgelbüchlein by Bach. Sometimes the pages were too small for a long choral, and he continued in tablature.
So even in what it was 1710, 13, or even later, Johann Sebastian Bach knew this tablature notation and used it when the situation was needed, right? When he needed.
Yes, and we have to assume that he started learning by tablature, because we have these copies from Buxtehude and Reinken choral fantasias from before 1700. So the very young 13 or 14 years old Bach copied in tablature, in North German tablature, these pieces. And later he started writing in partition.
Wonderful. So let's return to our idea of what kind of organ music was played in the German Lutheran services in the 17th century. And you mentioned that Magnificat probably were played during Vesper services, right? Alternatim with the chorale chant or the choir, polyphonic choir sometimes, right? What else was required?
Yes, then the organist had to accompany the choir in motets. I think also the big Pelplin tablature is served for this purpose, to play the polychoral motets together with the choir. Perhaps playing one choir only on the organ and the other was sung. We don't know. And another thing is to take some verses of the ordinarium pieces. I investigated in Visby and Celle the Kyrie and also the Gloria things. In Pomerania, at the Gloria beginning, the organist was not allowed to play. Only at the end they started with Gloria in Excelsis et in Terra Pax, then they sung the hymn Allein Gott in der Höhe sei er, and afterwards, from Laudamus Te on, alternatim, the organist was allowed to play. In Hamburg it was a little bit different. He played from the beginning each second verse. So the priest or the choir started Gloria in Excelsis and the Et in Terra was played on the organ. We can see this in Visby. In Celle we find 6 variations on Allein Gott in der Höhe sei er in very different mode. One is choral that is a little bit broadened by the organist with single lines that he he brought. How do I say? They sing one line and then he plays one line and they sing the next.
Alternating, right?
No, within the chorale in one verse.
Interesting technique. It's like a responsorium, no?
Yeah, he made like an interlude.
Interlude. Interlude. Yeah.
There are some verses. There's one chorale where he made verses like interludes, and others are like a choral fantasia. So there must have been occasions to play also longer for one.
And you mentioned these polychoral motets, and the organist was really required to accompany, right? And I've heard that sometimes when choir was absent, organist was required also to play the motet instead of the choir, to intabulate, basically, intabulations. And we have these examples by Scheidemann, of course.
I think that was a little bit later, in the 17th century, not in the 16th. We know from Hamburg that only one cantorei, one choir, was responsible for 4 churches, the 4 main churches. And so they couldn't be everywhere. They sang every Sunday in one of these 4 churches, and the other 3 organists had to play, instead of the choir, a bigger motet or perhaps choral fantasia. Scheidemann, Reinken, and these pieces, the bigger choral Bearbeitung, or also the Scheidemann motet intabulations may have been for this purpose.
Wonderful. And this Vis Vitalis, for example, is it connected with the Svelling school, or is it a little different? What do you think?
In my opinion, the newest pieces, also these of David Herlitz, but also the sketches, the pieces from Berend Petri himself, show a little bit influence of Jan Pieterszoon Svelink. It's not ecotechnic, it's not the late Jan Pieterszoon Svelink, but as we realize, Jacob Pretorius had been in Amsterdam before teaching Berend Petri. It was not the most elaborated school that Scheidemann had 10 years later. So I think Svelink, when he had started teaching the German Hamburg pupils, started also elaborating his system, and the later music is very much more modern, and this is not to be seen in Visby.
And when you read these church orders, right, Kirchenagenden in German, what do you find about congregational singing in those days? For example, today, especially in the Lutheran world, we know that congregational singing is worldwide, right? But what was in 17th century, or even in the beginning of the Reformation?
The beginning in 16th century, it was very important for Bugenhagen, for instance, who wrote the Northern German church orders, that the congregation was able to learn the new songs. So the organist shouldn't play with them, he shouldn't disturb the singing, but the congregation should sing alternatim with the choir. So both choir and congregation learned the new German psalms. And the organist was allowed to make a prelude, sometimes an interlude, and at the end he was allowed to play once more. But he should not play verses, because they should sing all verses.
So basically, choir sang without the organ, you saying, sort of a cappella, right? And also congregation a cappella. That's very radical idea for people without any special musical training to keep in tune and rhythm, right?
I think that singers from the choir were the leading singers for the congregation. They sang with the congregation.
That helps.
And then alternatim they sang polychoral.
So when people really are leaders, then they can even mix with the congregation sometimes. That helps really, and that has some influence with today's world, right? Sometimes people have this idea of taking people from the choir and putting them among congregation to help them sing.
We have today, for instance, in Denmark, the tradition that some singers at the organ balcony sing very loud the melody together with the congregation to get them in the right tone and to help them to learn the melodies.
And how about the tempo? I've heard that the tempo was rather slow of the singing.
It seems to have been very slow, so that after every single line they had to breathe and to start new. And that was the point where later around 1700, the organist started to make interludes and then to get the parish, the congregation, back to the right tone.
But not every congregation liked those interludes, right?
That's
Remember
right.
the story about Bach going to Lübeck to learn with Buxtehude and coming back after 3 or 4 months and then playing those wild-sounding interludes, and the people were saying, "What is going on? We don't want this." They didn't know when to start the new line, basically, because of these improvisations, right?
There were diminished accords, and so it
Chromatic
was very,
harmonies.
very, very difficult. It's not quite clear when these chorals were composed. Maybe he composed them before that his Vertreter,
Predecessor.
his predecessor, the person that had to play when he was in Lübeck.
Oh, substitute.
Yes.
Substitute, great.
It may be that the chorals have been composed before for the person who worked as substitute for him when he was in Lübeck, but we don't know.
Well, such a distant time, right? 300 years ago or even 400 years ago you are talking about. So distant memories, right? But it still lives this music through your pieces that you're playing tonight, for example, right? What is your most inspiring piece you will be playing tonight on this program for you?
Oh, I think indeed that this David Herlitz is a very inspiring piece, because it lets us show on this very far away time, on this service, on the Vespera that has been 400 years ago. And it's amazing music. It's very good music.
Wonderful. I thank you so much for this conversation. And before we finish, Matthias, I'd like to ask you about where our listeners can find your work online. Maybe you have a website or a link.
I'm working at Greifswald University in northern Germany, and you find it on the website of our university, uni-greifswald.de.
Excellent. I will put the link into the description of this conversation. Thank you so much. You are so generous and insightful, and you're doing work that matters to these researchers, but not only to the researchers, but also to the entire organ world. I wish you so many years of success in the future and exciting musical adventures where you find not only in Visby but only in other secret perhaps libraries and archives in the future. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.